12. So we'll make a start. So today we have Dr. Vincent Ramos and Dr. Jan Einhoff with us to talk about their work on welfare retrenchment and the familization of young adults' living arrangements. I was rehearsing how to say familization because I'm not sure I've said that word out loud very much. Jan is a research scientist at Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock and the Maxwell Center for Social Inequalities and Population Health. He has a PhD in sociology from Humboldt University in Berlin, and his research interests are in social demography, population aging, and quantitative methods. Dr. Vincent Ramos is a research fellow at the ESRC Center for Pop Change, Connecting Generations, here with us in Southampton. He's working on topics at the intersection of employment uncertainty and intergenerational exchange. He holds a PhD from Hertie School, Berlin, with the Dynamics Research Training Group. So I will hand the floor over to Vincent and Jan. At the end of their presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, which I'll moderate. So without further delay, Vincent, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bernice. I hope you can see my slides and hear me clearly. I'm delighted to co-present this work with Jan Einhoff of the Max Planck Institute on welfare retrenchment and the familization of young adults' living arrangements. And this is joint work with Anne Barrington, who's also joining us in the call. So this is very much a work in progress, and so we welcome all types of comments and feedback. And we've left plenty of time towards the end of our presentation for that. And I want to jump right into it and start with a bit of context setting by drawing on the welfare state literature, which generally characterizes the post-war welfare state as aiming to quote-unquote defamilize social and economic risk. In this era, there was a reduced dependence of individual well-being on families, and in liberal welfare states, including the UK, the means-tested income support provided a floor of economic independence, albeit arguably imperfect. But fast forward to the aftermath of the global financial crisis, whereby discussions surrounding fiscal consolidation intensified and resulted to the Welfare Reform Act of 2012. And at its cornerstone is the Universal Credit Program, which I'll be talking about extensively in a while. Now, over the past decade or so, a thick strand of the literature has emerged to try to better understand the implications of these policy changes around this decade, and many of which contend that the increased role of families in buffering against social and economic risk. And so families sort of stepped in more. And so the overarching question around these past years was that does welfare retrenchment or did welfare retrenchment lead to a familization in outcomes? And these outcomes are far and wide-ranging. But around the same period that these reforms were happening around the world, there's also been an observed increase in parental coresidence globally. Some of you might have seen this figure from Esteve and Reher's paper in Population and Development Review in 2021, where they find a significant decadal increase in parental co-residence across all ages 20 plus globally, or at least in the countries in their sample. And if you look at the panel on the left, this is most pronounced for young adults aged 20 and 25 and 30, and it's significant all the way up to adulthood. And so they end the paper by posing an interesting question, which is why do we observe a pattern that seems to run counter to our expectations of a reduced parental co-residence alongside modernization and cultural change? And of course, economic uncertainty is a part and parcel of that explanation. And so we build on that strand of the literature in intergenerational co-residence and the welfare state literature, and I try to address three questions in this paper. The first is, did the universal credit reform increase the probability of parental co-residence among program-eligible young adults? And the second research question that we have is more of a mechanism question, which is why, right? Why would we observe this effect? Is it because co-residence attenuates the household income losses from unemployment under universal credit relative to the legacy system? And finally, we're interested in heterogeneities, right? So is the effect of the universal credit reform on parental co-residence different across gender and family status and unemployment risk? Now, in answering these questions, our aim is to contribute to the literature in three ways. The first is by analyzing the relationship between welfare reforms and parental co-residence. We want to extend prior work that has so far focused more on material outcomes, particularly income and food insecurity, crime and mental health, to look at living arrangements and parental co-residence. Second is we want to conceptualize and understand parental co-residence as a familization response. We want to assess whether co-residence acts as a buffer for economic insecurity as a whole. And finally, we recognize that the effects of universal credit reform on parental co-residence might be heterogeneous, right, across gender and family status and labor market risk. And so we embed this heterogeneity analysis within the heterogeneous causal effects framework that have gained traction in recent years. Now, I talk extensively about the universal credit reform, but I guess it's important to first start by understanding what the universal credit reform actually did. And so it was the centerpiece of the Welfare Reform Act of 2012, which consolidated, and the Universal Credit Program essentially consolidated six legacy benefits into a single payment scheme, right? So all these legacy benefits that you see listed here were all combined into a single payment scheme. Now, at the time, the stated aims of the government was to reduce fraud, for administrative streamlining and simplification, and more importantly, to incentivize labor force participation. And so they paid particular attention to the design of the payment scheme so that it incentivizes labor force participation. And the Universal Credit Program was not rolled out in one go. It was rolled out across local authority districts between 2013 and 2018. So if you can see the map here on the slide, you would see that by 2013 and 2014, some local authorities have rolled it out. It slowly was rolled out across local authorities up until 2018, when at least one job center in every local authority have rolled out universal credit. But it's not just that the universal credit was rolled out across local authorities, they were also rolled out in a staggered manner across demographic groups. So for example, before July 2014, single and childless, it was only available for single and childless young adults who are not in self-employment or not a full-time student. And so if you were in an LAD eligible district, before July 2014, you have to fall under these demographic groups to be eligible to apply. And of course, subsequently, it was expanded to include other demographic groups, including those who are coupled and partnered and lone parents, etc. And over the past few years, there have been many research on the effects of the universal credit reform on material hardship and well-being. It has been found that universal credit reduced benefit income, particularly for single young adults. It increased housing insecurity in the form of debt arrears. It also increased food insecurity measured by accessing food banks. And in particular, it worsened mental health, especially for single childless young adults. And this is complementing the other literature finding the broader effects of spending cutbacks in that period. So these are papers that are not tied to the Universal Credit Program, but are more around the spending cutbacks in general across local authorities over that decade. And these papers find exacerbated family stress, deterred childbearing among the economically vulnerable, and a former CPC working paper also shows increased local crime rates at the local authority levels. And so we take these as a general suggestion that quote unquote austerity decade had some negative and adverse implications across a wide range of outcomes. But to date, there's been no direct evidence on living arrangements and in particular parental co-residence. But why would we expect parental co-residence to be a familization response? There are multiple reasons for why young adults live with parents, and we could categorize them into three overarching motives. The first would be, well, because parental home serves as a buffer against immediate economic hardship from unemployment. So, in this sense, the parental home acts as a safety net that prevents or that cushions the shocks from unemployment and operates, as I said, as a safety net. But we also know that co-residence could facilitate longer job search and more selective labor market entry, while young adults benefit from in-kind support from parents. And so collectively, parental co-residence acts as a scaffold that could help support and propel young adults towards more successful residential and economic independence subsequently. And finally, there are explanations focused on reciprocity, whereby co-residence is an implicit or explicit arrangement to ensure future exchange. And indeed, there is some evidence that labor market insecurity is positively associated with parental co-residence among young adults in the UK. In a recent article in the European Sociological Review, we find that unemployment and underemployment and temporary and agency work, all being forms of labor market insecurity, are all positively associated with parental co-residence among the economically active young adults. But why would we think that unemployment under universal credit, right, would have a different effect, right? What exactly did the universal credit reform do? Well, under universal credit, it was observed that there's been reduced benefit income, especially among single and childless young adults. For example, among single and childless young adults under the age of 35, the housing allowance that they would have under universal credit is typically capped at the lower value shared accommodation rate, which is lower than the one bedroom rate. So for example, in Southampton, this shared accommodation rate would be about 40% lower than the one bedroom rate, which would make independent living less affordable. Second, the removal of parental means testing creates some kind of opportunity. Under the legacy system, an adult child who was co-residing with parents could have plausibly reduced the housing benefits received by the parents if the parents were receiving any. Under universal credit, this process was simplified. And for non-dependents under the age of 21, this was scrapped entirely. And so this universal credit reform essentially removed the implicit penalty of co-residence for parents. And finally, we know that the universal credit came with conditionality and job search requirements, which arguably created a more high-pressure environment for young adults. And because of the sanctions for non-compliance with job search, which again created this high-pressure environment, young adults may consider parental co-residence as having some kind of support in a way that they can benefit from parental in-kind support while still claiming universal credit. And so we take this together and hypothesize that the universal credit reform increased the likelihood of unemployed young adults to co-reside with parents. And the next question that we're interested in is that we hypothesize that this effect is different by gender. And we draw in some social policy literature which state that women were never really fully defamilized in the UK context. Women are still more likely to work part-time and bear caregiving responsibilities. The welfare entitlements that women receive were historically tied to family structures and partnership arrangements, and the legacy system already assumed partial dependence. But apart from this more social policy type of explanation, we also know that there are alternative familization pathways by gender. For example, men's economic positions are considered to be more central to partnership formation than women's. And therefore, for unemployed men, the reduced benefits that they have, plus some breadwinner expectations, might make them consider parental co-residence more as a response to unemployment. And so we hypothesize that the effect of the universal credit reform on parental co-residence is more pronounced for men than for women. And finally, we try to understand why. And we start with a hypothesis that if co-residence indeed serves as a buffer, then it should attenuate the household income losses caused by unemployment. Why? Because for a co-residing young adult, their individual earnings represent only a fraction of the total household income. And therefore, the shocks from unemployment are diluted by other household income sources. So, for example, by parental income, right? Whereas for independently living young adults, they fully absorb the household income shocks due to unemployment. And so we hypothesize that that parental co-residence attenuates the household income losses from unemployment under universal credit. And we also do a couple of additional exploratory heterogeneity analyses. We first try to understand whether there is heterogeneities by family status, right? So is the effect of the universal credit reform on co-residence more pronounced among those who are single and childless? And another is by unemployment risk, right? So is the effect, for example, of the reform stronger for those who are most vulnerable in the labor market? And so I now hand over to Jan, who will discuss the data and the methods and the results of our analysis.
Thank you, Vincent. Next slide, please. Yeah. So for our empirical analysis, we use data from Understanding Society. This is panel data. And we also use the restricted version, which includes precise information on respondents' residents in the UK's local authority districts. And that allows us to match this data to the rollout schedule of universal credit that is provided by the Department for Work and Pensions. In our sample, we include young adults who are aged between 18 and 34 during any time from 2011 to 2020. So that gives us some time before and after the implementation of universal credit. Then importantly, we apply baseline weights, and this allows us to account for the unequal sampling probabilities in understanding society, for example, due to the oversampling of certain regions or minority groups. And our final sample consists of around 22,000 individuals. Around half of them are female, and those individuals provide us with around 81,000 person years, and around 2,000 of those individuals are ever treated. That's around 9% of our sample. And by ever treated, we mean that those people become unemployed and are at the same time eligible for universal credit at the time of the interview. Next slide, please. Now, for the main analysis, our outcome is a simple binary indicators, which indicates whether a person is living at home with their parents at the time of the interview. Our treatment variable is an interaction between an indicator for whether a person is currently unemployed and an indicator for universal credit eligibility. And as Vincent said before, universal credit eligibility is a bit complicated because it was rolled out across regions and changes over time. So we define individuals as eligible for universal credit if at least one job center in their local authority district rolled out universal credit, and they must additionally meet several demographic conditions. And from April 2013, universal credit applied to single adults without children in the household, and they could also not be self-employed or full-time students. And this group was then expanded in July 2014 to include couples without children, and was again expanded in January 2016 to also include households with own children. And then in the analyses, we include several additional variables, which we include as controls in our models. Next slide, please. So our main analysis focuses on the first two hypotheses, and the first one is about the overall effect of universal credit on the likelihood of unemployed young adults to live with their parents. And then secondly, as Vincent mentioned, we expect this effect to be more pronounced for men than for women. And for the analysis, we exploit the gradual rollout of universal credit across local authority districts, which is an ideal setup for difference in difference analysis. However, there's a large recent literature which argued that in precisely this setting, there are a number of challenges that come from the staggered treatment rollout, and that might also be due to treatment effects that might be heterogeneous across treatment cohorts, and or also due to the low number of treated units that we have in our sample. So instead of a standard two-way fixed effects model, we opted for a two-stage imputation estimator, which was recently introduced by Gartner and which can better handle all those challenges. And the key idea of this estimator is to first use in a first stage only units who are not yet and never treated, and to use those units to predict the counterfactual outcomes for the units that are actually treated. And then in the second stage, we can compare the predicted and observed outcomes, and that gives us the causal effect of universal credit on those people who are actually treated who become unemployed and are eligible. And we run those models separately for men and women. And on the slide, you can also see the model that we use for the imputation step, the first stage of the estimation, where we regress the outcome on an indicator for whether a person is unemployed, on several age-related indicators, on an indicator for whether a person is still in education, on their marital status, on whether they have a child in the household. We also include region-specific time trends as well as person and time fixed effects. Next slide, please. We run a different analysis to test our mechanism, our third hypothesis, which argues that parental coresidence really attenuates the income losses that are induced by unemployment under universal credit compared to the legacy system. And for this, we simply change our outcome to the equivalized household net income, which we measure in absolute pounds. And we basically run the same difference in difference setup, but now we interact our treatment with people's coresidence status. And here the interpretation would be that if we see lower income losses among young adults who co-reside with their parents, that would indicate the buffering effect that the mechanism implies. Next slide, please. Next one. Yeah. So I will start just with some descriptive findings. These graphs show you the coresidence rates among men and women, and then also disaggregated by employment status. And as expected, we see a higher rate, significantly higher rate among young men compared to young women. We also see the highest rates of parental coresidence among young men and women who are still in education, and that's perhaps not that surprising. Then we also see high rates among those who are unemployed. Those rates are higher than for young adults who are still in employment. And then one interesting finding is that the coresidence rate is lowest among inactive women, and that likely reflects their different family arrangements. Next slide, please. So just quickly, this graph shows you the coresidence rates and how they change over time from before the rollout to after the rollout. And for both men and women, we see a slight increase in coresidence rates over time. Of course, that doesn't tell us much about the actual causal impact of the universal credit reform on coresidence behaviors. Next slide. Because that's what we are doing next. This graph shows you the results of our main difference analysis. And you see quite strikingly that the effect for men, the average treatment effect on men, is large and highly significant at 6 percentage points. So universal credit causally increased parental coresidence among unemployed young men by around 6 percentage points. And that's also what you see in the event study, namely that as soon as universal credit is rolled out in respondents' LEDs, there's a sharp increase in the likelihood of living with their parents among young men. And the opposite is true for women, where we basically don't find an effect at all. The average treatment effect is 0, and also the event study estimates are basically flat. Next slide, please. So before we go on with the mechanism test, I just want to show you some additional robustness checks to show that our results really hold across different samples, across different event windows, and also different disestimators. So we excluded, for example, people who move between local authority districts, because that might also be endogenously driven by the reform. We also exclude people who change their family structures over time, because that might also be a response to universal credit. And for all those different robustness checks, our estimates remain stable. One exception is that if we include inactivity alongside unemployment, we find the same effect for men, but there is a slightly positive and statistically significant effect For women, that's the only exception. If we vary the event window, for example, or if we use different estimators, or also if we exclude early adopting local authority districts, our estimates remain highly stable. Next slide, please. So we now turn to our mechanism and the question whether coresidence can really serve as a buffer against income shocks from unemployment under universal credit. And we again run these analyses separately by gender. And on the left-hand side of both panels, you see the overall effect of universal credit on people's equivalized household income in pound. And you see that there are small negative effects, but they're not distinguishable from zero. And that changes if we interact our treatment with people's co-resident status. And there we see that those who are not co-residing with their parents experience significantly larger income shocks compared to those who are still co-residing with their parents. And that's true for both men and women, but the effect for men is significantly larger. And that's in line with our expected mechanism. One back, yeah. So just to briefly summarize, just to the summary slide. So just as a quick summary of the results so far, we find support for our first hypothesis, namely that universal credit significantly increased the probability of parental coresidence. However, secondly, this effect is only present for unemployed young men. And then lastly, in line with our idea of buffering, we find that universal credit strongly reduces household income. But again, this is only true for those individuals who are not co-residing with their parents. Now, all those effects are estimated for the whole population, but in the next steps, we are also interested in who is actually most affected by the universal credit reform. Next slide. So we run a number of heterogeneity tests. First, we look at a very obvious, simple, observed individual characteristic, which is people's age. And there we split the sample into three groups, 18 to 22, 23 to 27, and 28 to 34, and run separate analyses on these groups. And next, we turn to a more latent individual characteristics, which is people's unemployment risk. And here we simply use a logistic regression model to predict how likely people are to enter unemployment based on characteristics that we observed in their first wave, which are their highest education, their ethnicity, their marital status, their region, their household size, whether they have own children, and whether they are born in the UK or not. And then we predict their risk of unemployment and split people into three groups for those who are at high risk, medium risk, and low risk of experiencing unemployment. And then we run separate analyses on these three groups. And then lastly, we turn to the wider household context and look at four different family structure types, at people who are married and do have children, at people who are not married and have children, at those who are married and have no children, and those who are neither married nor have children. Next slide, please. So what you see here are heterogeneous effects by age. On the leftmost side, you see the overall effect that I showed you before, and then separately for the three age groups. And you see that for women, the effects are basically zero, or not indifferent from zero across all three age groups. And then interestingly, for men, you see that the effects are really concentrated among the youngest men, especially those who are 18 to 22 and 23 to 27. And you see a large negative, but statistically almost not significant effect for the oldest age group among men. Next slide. Now we do the same for unemployment risk, and the story doesn't really change for women. We don't find significant effects across all three unemployment risk groups. And for men, again, we see that those men who are at the highest risk of unemployment, who are the least advantaged group in the labor market, also show the highest response to universal credit. So they are both more likely to actually become unemployed, and they are also most affected by the reform in terms of parental coresidence. Next, please. And now lastly, we look at family structure. And here you see very similar results for both men and women in the first three groups. But we also find that for both men and women who are not married and don't have children, there is a significant effect of the reform on parental coresidence. So it really seems that those who are not married and don't have children are most affected by the reform, regardless of their gender. Next slide, please. So I think there are three main takeaways from our analysis. First, we find that young people are significantly more likely to live with their parents as a result of universal credit. However, this impact of the reform is really concentrated among unmarried childless individuals, both men and women, and among young men who are most disadvantaged in the labor market. And those are also the groups that are already most likely to co-reside with their parents. And then we also find support for the hypothesized buffer mechanism. Namely, we find that living with parents really shields unemployed young adults from income losses that are induced by the universal credit reform. Next, please. There are, of course, some limitations, but those limitations also point to future research. One limitation is that we look at this stock, but we can't really look at the flow of parental coresidence. So we don't know whether the reform discouraged home leaving among people or whether it pulled people back into the parental home. Secondly, we don't really know whether people actually receive universal credit. We just look at people who are in principle program eligible. So what we do is we estimate intent to treat effects because we don't know whether they actually receive universal credit. And then a last important question concerns the non-material consequences of parental coresidence and especially of involuntary parental coresidence that we might observe as a result of unemployment under universal credit. So we showed you the impact on household income, but we don't know much about non-material consequences. But still, overall, I think the takeaway message from our analysis is that parental coresidence can really act as a familization response to welfare retrenchment that we saw under universal credit. Thank you.